October 27, 1962. The air in the White House Situation Room is thick enough to cut with a knife, humming with the low, electric tension of impending doom. A U-2 spy plane has just been shot down over Cuba, an act of war that screams for retaliation. Everyone in that room knows the countdown to global thermonuclear exchange has accelerated past the point of no return. But what if the entire world was saved not by bravado, but by a single meticulously hidden promise made hours before the Soviet withdrawal announcement? How much of the world's greatest nuclear standoff was built on a lie of omission? At the very moment Washington was publicly demanding Khrushchev pull his missiles out of Cuba, a parallel, utterly secret negotiation was concluding that would remove American missiles from Turkish soil, a trade the public would not learn about for years, all to protect the fragile optics of NATO unity. This is the story of the quid pro quo that vanished into the shadows of Cold War diplomacy. The deployment began quietly, an incremental escalation months before the crisis truly erupted. In 1961, the United States began installing PGM-19 Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles across Turkey, placing 15 of these powerful weapons near Izmir, capable of striking deep into the Soviet heartland. These were not purely defensive. They were a strategic chess move, a physical counterweight to Soviet expansion. By November 1961, those missile sites were operational. They sat there, silent, waiting. The Soviets saw them as an intolerable first-strike threat, a violation of strategic parity that demanded response. The crisis arrived in October 1962, not with a bang, but with grainy photographic evidence. The discovery of Soviet SS-12 missile sites under construction in Cuba sent Washington into a spiral. The pressure on the president was immense. On October 23, as the military readiness level rose, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ex-COM, met. The debate raged: invade, bomb, or blockade. On the hottest day in Washington, D.C., the decisions were being made under incredible scrutiny. Every word uttered, every posture struck, had to project unwavering resolve. To show weakness, especially to the Turkish allies who hosted the Jupiters, was unthinkable. Then came the turning point, October 27th. The U-2 downing raised the stakes to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level short of actual war. Simultaneously, secret back channels were frantically working overtime. The understanding was forged: the USSR would withdraw its weapons from Cuba in exchange for a public American pledge never to invade the island. But woven into the fabric of that public concession was the secret thread. The United States agreed, in a parallel, unwritten understanding, to eventually remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This was the hidden trade that defused the bomb. The next morning, Moscow announced the withdrawal. The immediate danger passed, but the deep political cleanup began immediately. The Soviet removal of weapons was public, the American removal was not. For months, the United States worked to dismantle the missiles in Italy and Turkey while maintaining the illusion that the removal was part of a routine modernization schedule, a necessary follow-up unrelated to the Cuban drama. Internal memos from November 1962 discuss the political and military considerations surrounding those very missiles, acknowledging the peril of keeping them there while the crisis was active. The official narrative required that the U.S. must appear to be in total control. Making unilateral concessions to the Soviets in Turkey would have destabilized NATO at its core. The Turkish government, a vital ally, could not be seen as having been forced into a concession under duress, nor could the U.S. appear to have traded them away as bargaining chips. The optics had to be flawless. The implementation of the secret deal dragged through the early months of 1963. Negotiations with Ankara proved tricky, bogged down by the pride and strategic concerns of the Turkish military establishment. They demanded assurances that the removal was not a punishment, but part of a broader defense upgrade. It wasn't until February that internal communications referenced the final stages of negotiation, moving toward what was called Operation Pot Pie II. By April 1963, the process was irreversible. The United States Air Force began the steps to dismantle the Jupiter squadrons, first in Italy, then in Turkey. All the while, the official line remained that the Jupiters were becoming obsolete, soon to be replaced by Polaris submarine-launched missiles, a slower, less provocative deterrent. Even the parallel removal of the older Thor missiles from the United Kingdom was finalized by August 1963, cloaked in the same guise of strategic obsolescence. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved by firm resolve and clear negotiation. They saw the public pledge not to invade Cuba. They did not see the coded cables or the private meetings establishing the timeline for the silent decommissioning of the Turkish launch sites. The full scope of this nuclear bargain, this crucial quid pro quo that kept the world from midnight, remained buried in classified archives, hidden for years to protect the perception of Allied solidarity, a secret testament to how delicate and often deceptive crisis management truly is. Chapter 3. Scar. The scars left by the Cuban Missile Crisis were not only etched onto the political map of the Cold War, they were deeply embedded in the diplomatic psyche of every nation involved. The immediate aftermath saw a flurry of earnest attempts to ensure such a terrifying near miss could never happen again. The most tangible outcome was the establishment of the Washington-Moscow hotline, a direct teletype link designed to allow immediate, unambiguous communication between the heads of state, bypassing cumbersome embassy channels. It was a technological band-aid applied to a gaping wound, a tacit admission that miscommunication had nearly doomed civilization. Yet even as the hotline was being installed in the summer of 1963, the deep structural issues that precipitated the crisis remained unresolved. The removal of the Turkish Jupiters, while essential for cooling Soviet anger, created a vacuum in NATO's southern flank that the alliance struggled to fill convincingly. For Turkey, the removal felt less like a strategic evolution and more like being pawned off the board when the main game concluded. Their national security posture, once bolstered by visible, immediate deterrence, was now reliant on U.S. commitment delivered via less threatening, longer-range submarine platforms. The trust in Washington, though superficially maintained, carried a new layer of cynicism. Turkish officials understood, perhaps better than their American counterparts admitted, that their strategic value had been explicitly bartered away to save the reputations of larger players. The political repercussions within the United States were equally complex. President Kennedy, having navigated the crisis successfully, emerged with enormous political capital, yet he was acutely aware of the tightrope walk he had executed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, many of whom had advocated for immediate military strikes against Cuba, viewed the secret deal as a dangerous appeasement, a soft underbelly exposed to Soviet blackmail. This internal friction ensured that while the public narrative celebrated Kennedy's firmness, the military establishment remained deeply skeptical of negotiated restraint when nuclear weapons were involved. The lesson learned by the Pentagon was not restraint, but the need for more overwhelming conventional superiority to prevent the need for such risky nuclear brinkmanship in the future. The Soviet perspective was equally nuanced. Khrushchev had successfully forced the removal of missiles poised on his doorstep, achieving a significant strategic win without firing a shot. This victory, however, came at a heavy internal cost. Many hardliners in the Presidium viewed the public backing down over Cuba as humiliating, undermining his authority. They argued that he had traded strategic positioning, the missiles in Cuba, for strategic parity, the missiles in Turkey, and had done so under immense pressure. This perception of weakness contributed directly to the political maneuvering that would eventually lead to Khrushchev's ouster 2 years later. The silent removal of the Jupiters became a key historical footnote used by his rivals to argue that he had mismanaged the confrontation, failing to secure lasting gains from a moment of extreme leverage. The secrecy surrounding the Jupiter trade was perhaps the most enduring scar on the diplomatic landscape. For decades, the official histories focused solely on the public exchange, Soviet withdrawal for the non-invasion pledge. The Turkish component remained relegated to whispers among retired diplomats and deep in declassified cables released only years later. This deliberate obfuscation reveals a fundamental truth about crisis management at the highest levels. Appearances often matter more than objective strategic reality. To admit that American Jupiter missiles were traded away, missiles that had been publicly touted as vital deterrents, would have implied that the initial deployment was purely provocative and ultimately disposable. It would have undermined the core principle of alliances, that commitments are absolute. The historical record, when finally pieced together from multiple sources decades later, paints a picture far messier than the clean narrative of American victory. It suggests that deterrence is not a fixed state, but a fluid, transactional process. often requiring the sacrifice of lesser assets to preserve the greater structure. The entire structure of the deterrence system, the complex web of treaties, deployments, and mutually assured destruction protocols, was shown to be fundamentally reliant on hidden accommodations. The secret deal in October 1962 created a powerful precedent. It demonstrated that even when public posturing demands absolute rigidity, private flexibility remains the essential lubricant of survival. It validated the use of clandestine back channels as the ultimate safety valve. If a crisis escalates to the point where public statements become weapons of war, the only way back is through